Hello, everybody, and welcome to my Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate draft guide. In this video, I'm going to be providing you with all the information you need to do well in your Baldur's Gate drafts. But before I dive in, I want to remind you that if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel for more content. Let's get started. The first thing I'm going to cover are the set mechanics, specifically the arena exclusive mechanics, because those can be confusing. First up is Conjure. There's also Perpetually, Seek, Double Team, Boon, and finally Specialize. Starting things off with Conjure, this one is fairly straightforward. It will say conjure a card into your hand, and then you just put a copy of that card into your hand. So sometimes it'll be a creature, sometimes it'll be another card. With you line up the shot, you can choose to conjure a card named Plummet into your hand, or a card named Naturalize, or you can just simply choose the third mode of drawing a card. The next mechanic is the Perpetually mechanic. It will give a creature something permanently. So if that card were to change zones, if it goes to the graveyard, if it gets bounced back to their hand, if it leaves play and comes back, it keeps that whatever Perpetually thing has been given to it. So with Sewer Plague, if you target your opponent's creature, even if they somehow make it leave the battlefield and come back, it will keep the whatever minuses it had and will just continue to get smaller and smaller, even if it is changing zones. Next up is the Seek mechanic. This is a mechanic that lets you pick cards randomly from your deck based on the criteria, and then you'll just get to have those do whatever the card says. So with Seek New Knowledge, you seek 2 non-land cards, which means you draw 2 non-land cards from your deck, and then you get to put a card from your hand on the bottom of your library. So Seek is basically more specialized card draw. Next is Double Team. This is a mechanic where if the card attacks, you conjure a copy of it to your hand, and then both copies lose Double Team. So with Ranger Squadron, once you attack your opponent with your 6-mana 3/4 flyer, you get another 6-mana 3/4 flyer in your hand, and then you have both cards lose the Double Team mechanic. So you don't get to keep spamming them, but you do get to have a couple of them. Next up is Boon. This is a mechanic that rewards a future creature with a buff of some kind. The way that it works in a card like Dragonborn Immolator is when it dies, you note its power, and you get a boon with when you cast your next creature spell, it perpetually gets +X+0, where X is the noted number. So if it dies as a 2/4, then the next creature you play gets +2/+0 permanently, because it is a perpetual buff. So that's just the way Boon works, and there are other cards that work that way. Next up is the Specialized mechanic. This one is very complicated, but in simple terms, the way it works is you have a creature and it has the Specialized ability, a sorcery speed ability. It's important to know that. And you activate your Specialized ability and discard a card. Now that card can be a land or a card that has a color. And depending on what type of land you discard or what color the card that you discard is, you will get a different version of the card, and it actually becomes that card. So if it dies, if it changes zones, it will remain that card. So for example, Viconia Nightsinger's Disciple is 1 and a black for a 2/3, and it has Specialized 2, and it also has 1 exile target card from a graveyard. And then if you do specialize it, let's just say you discard a green card, it will become Viconia Disciple of Strength, which then has special benefits based on the fact that it is the green version of the card. And then all of the different colors all have different benefits. So that's just a relatively complex mechanic. You're probably just going to have to read all of the cards that have that ability. Moving on to the top commons, starting off with white, we have at number 1, Priest of Ancient Lore, a great little 2-for-1 attached to a creature, and it plays well with some of the other synergies in the set, as we will see later. Just a great common in any deck. At number 2 is Flaming Fist Duskguard, a card that may just look like a 2-mana 3/1, but actually acts almost like a 2-mana 4/1 because it is going to buff the next creature that you play, which is especially nice because it can buff creatures that maybe have evasion or some other ability like lifelink, and a buff on those types of creatures can even be more valuable. Moving on to number 3 is Blessed Hippogriff, a card that is a nice tool for an aggressive deck as a 2/3 flyer that can give other creatures flying, but also as a combat trick and potential 2-for-1 thanks to its adventure ability. So Blessed Hippogriff comes in at number 3. It's a little bit more expensive and a little bit more situational, but the combination of the adventure and the strong creature brings it in at number 3. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is a Young Blue Dragon. There is a dragon's theme in this set, and this is the perfect card for any dragon deck. It is an adventure card, so you can cast the adventure half as scry 1, then draw a card, and then it has the 5-mana 3/3 flying ability as a card that you can play after you've already gotten some value and drawn a card from it. So it replaces itself. It's a nice flying threat, and it is a great card in your deck. At number 2 is Wizened Githzerai. It is a 2/1 for 2 mana, and whenever it becomes blocked, the creature gets -2/-0 perpetually. And note that that happens before damage, so this card is basically unblockable in the early turns of the game, and even later on into the game will cause some damage even if your opponent does manage to kill it by blocking. At number 3 is Undersimplify, a counter spell that you can play in the early turns of the game, and even if your opponent does have the ability to pay for it, they are going to not only have to pay the extra mana, but also have a smaller creature as a result. And it is worth noting that it can counter any type of spell, not just creatures, so definitely a counter spell to be aware of. Moving on to black, at number 1 is Grim Bounty, a 4-mana kill spell that generates you a treasure token. It's simple, it's straightforward, but it is quite powerful. At number 2 is Deadly Dispute, a card draw spell for black that works excellently with the treasure themes in the set, as you can sacrifice a treasure to draw 2 cards, and then you generate a treasure so you don't even go down a resource, but you do gain the 2 cards into your hand. And you can also, because it is an instant, use it in response to removal spells and turn a creature that was going to die anyway into 2 extra cards. And then at number 3 is Guildsworn Prowler, a card that trades well as a Death Touch card on blocks, but gets you an extra bit of value if you are able to trade it on attacks or by sacrificing it to something like a Deadly Dispute, because it doesn't have to just die from attacking, it just says if it wasn't blocking. So you can get quite a bit of value from this card, or just use it as a 2-mana 2/1 Death Touch, which is already good. Moving on to red, at number 1 is Dragon's Fire, a card that is a 2-mana deal 3 at instant speed most of the time, but can sometimes be even better than that if you have a dragon in play or a dragon in your hand. It is just an excellent card and one that you will want to take early. At number 2 is Hobgoblin Captain, a creature that can attack, very hard to block if you have the pack tactics, and just is a nice little threat and a great card to play in the early game. And then at number 3 is Valor Singer, a card that can buff up your creatures and make combat a little bit trickier for your opponent, and because it can give any creature +1/+0, at the very least it can buff itself and be a 3-mana 3/3. Moving on to green, at number 1 is Underseller Myconid. It is 3 mana for a 1/2, but it comes into play with an extra 1/1, so it's like 2/3 worth of stats, and it can tap to add 1 mana of any color, which is excellent for mana ramping you. And then when it dies, you also get another 1/1, so just quite a bit of value, not only in stats, but also the ability to ramp you. At number 2 is Owlbear, a great card and one that is in contention with Underseller Myconid for number 1, but because it's a little bit more expensive, it is nice to sometimes be able to prioritize the cheap cards that can ramp into cards like Owlbear. 5 mana for a 4/4 trample that draws a card when it enters the battlefield is just excellent, and a card that you will want to have many copies of if you can get them. And then at number 3 is a green removal spell, Band Together. This one is very nice because it avoids many of the downsides of traditional green removal spells, which is that oftentimes they are at sorcery speed, and oftentimes if your opponent kills your creature in response to the green removal spell, your opponent is going to be able to get a 2-for-1. However, with Band Together, if you have 2 creatures that are sufficiently large, you can use Band Together targeting both creatures and then target your opponent's creature, and you're going to be able to kill your opponent's creature even if your opponent has a removal spell. So it's good to know about that interaction, and also just an instant speed removal spell in green that is oftentimes going to be able to kill what you want is nice, so it comes in at number 3. Moving on to the archetype guides and starting things off with red-white. This is a color combination that is aggressive and cares about having creatures that are the same name, which is primarily going to be accomplished by the double team mechanic. So when your creature with double team is attacking, you are going to conjure a copy of it, and so you'll have 2 cards that have the same name and be able to use it for cards like Liara of the Flaming Fist, which is going to be able to give those creatures extra +1/+1, and then you can also use its ability to give other creatures double team as well. So it's a nice little synergy package to have in a deck that is going to be aggressive and is going to want those creatures for attacking purposes anyway. Moving on to blue-black, this is a color combination that cares about dealing damage to your opponent with your creatures. There are cards that will give you a nice little trigger for dealing damage to your opponent. Something like Goggles of Night can draw you an extra card, Horde Robber can generate you a treasure, and then Krydle is not only going to get you a little bit of life gain, milling your opponent, but also is going to be able to give your creatures evasion with its second ability. So this is a different take on blue-black, where you actually have some creatures and some proactive plays to be making instead of just going pure control. Moving on to green-white, this is a life gain color combination. You can use the cards like Prosperous Innkeeper to gain life, and trigger cards like your Celestial Unicorns to grow your creatures. And then also Trelisara Moon Dancer is a great gold uncommon that ties it all together by being a nice 2-drop that can help you filter through your deck and grow itself as a threat if you are able to gain life. Moving on to blue-white, this is a color combination that cares about having creatures leave the battlefield and then come back into play. You can use a card like Flaming Fist Officer to grow as your creatures leave play and come back. OG the Exquisite Blade is a great multicolored uncommon that gives you a nice benefit when it enters play. Gaining 2 life and scrying 2 is going to get you some nice card selection, and then when you are casting multiple spells in a turn, you're going to be able to exile your creatures and return them to battlefield to get whatever nice triggers they had. A card like Priest of Ancient Lore that we looked at earlier that can draw you a card when it enters play is particularly good with this sort of effect. And then finally, blue-white gains access to a card like Blur, which can exile a creature and return it to play, and you'll draw a card. So if you have a nice enters the battlefield effect that you want to use, you can use Blur to get it again. Moving on to white-black, this color combination does have a decent amount of overlap with the blue-white color combination, so some of those decks might want to splash cards from the other deck and things of that nature, because it does have some decent synergies. A card like Icewind Stalwart is going to fit great into both decks, because black-white, while blue-white cares about things entering play, black-white does have cards that care about creatures you control leaving the battlefield. And while that can be accomplished with them dying, it can also be accomplished with the exiling and return to play. So Icewind Stalwart can exile one of your creatures and have it enter the battlefield again, which is great for this archetype and is also good for the blue-white archetype. Nefarious Imp is going to let you scry whenever one or more permanents you control leave the battlefield. Note that this will include treasure tokens and things of that nature. And then Minthara of the Absolute is going to be a creature that lets your other creatures grow if you have Minthara in play, which is going to be a nice perk. Moving on to green-black, this is a deck that cares about your graveyard. If you have a card like Kaga, Shadow Archdruid, you can get a nice benefit and be able to get some value if you are milling cards directly from your deck into your graveyard. If you have a card like Circle of the Land Druid, it can not only facilitate cards like Kaga, but can also get you a little bit of value when it does die. And then Sigil of Miracle is going to be a way to benefit from having a fully stacked graveyard, and also to trigger some of your other cards by letting you mill a card every single turn. Moving on to black-red, this is an archetype that is going to care about sacrifice and treasure. So it gets a card like Sepulchre Ghoul to be a nice sacrifice outlet for other creatures. And one of the best ways to use a card like Sepulchre Ghoul is to pair it with Incessant Provocation, which is a way to gain control of one of your opponent's creatures and then attack them with it. And then after that, you can sacrifice it to your sacrifice effects and not only deal some damage to your opponent, but also get your opponent's creature off the board permanently with a card that other decks might not be as interested in. And then you can have Kalain Reclusive Painter tying things together by being a nice 2-drop that generates you a treasure for your treasure synergies, and also just is a card that will start ramping you with the treasure token or give you something to sacrifice, because you can sacrifice treasure to a lot of these cards, and it's just overall a nice 2-drop for the deck. And then the final kind of deck that I wanted to talk about is the Teamer deck, the green, blue, red deck. And this is all about dragons, and technically each of the 2 color combinations on its own is just perfectly playable, but they all care about dragons, so there's tons of overlap in the cards. And so sometimes you're going to want to go the 2 colors plus a splash of the third, and oftentimes you're going to be a pairing of these 2 colors. So you might be a blue-green deck, you might be a blue-red deck, or you might be a red-green deck, but all of these decks care about dragons in some capacity. So I just wanted to talk about them all together so it doesn't feel like any of them are getting a special treatment or anything like that in terms of the dragons that I happen to show on their slide. So all these decks are going to care about dragons. You'll gain access to cards like Corlessa, Scale Singer, Thrakkus the Butcher, and Lozan, Dragon's Legacy. All of these decks will play out slightly differently, but you'll want to be focusing on the dragons and the dragon payoffs. Moving on to the combat tricks section of this video, I just want to show all of the combat tricks that you'll have to be aware of at common, because you don't want to just stumble into your opponent's traps. In white, there are 4 combat tricks at common. You're Ambushed on the Road can give a creature /1/+3. Blessed Hippogriff, as we already discussed, can give Indestructible. You Hear Something on Watch can give all creatures +1/+1. And Valiant Farewell can give a creature +2/+0. In blue, there is Hypnotic Pattern, which is 1 mana and can give a creature -2/-0. and a creature actually -4, -0, and only 2 of it is perpetual. So you can give 2 different creatures -2, -0, or you can just give 1 creature -4, -0. So that's something that's worth knowing. Shocking Grasp also gives -2, -0. And it replaces itself by letting you draw a card. So if your opponent only has blue mana, then the -2, -0 is something that should be on your mind if there is a combat trick situation. In black, there is Armor of Shadows, which is a single mana to give +1/+0 and indestructible, and Manticore, which, while technically a creature, does oftentimes act as a combat trick by pseudo giving the creature Death Touch, because if your opponent makes a sketchy attack, Manticore is definitely something that should be on your mind because it'll turn any damage dealt to your creature into lethal damage. In red, there are 2 combat tricks, Dueling Rapier, which is going to give a creature +2/+0 for a single mana, and you come to the Knoll Camp, which is going to give a creature +3/+1 for 2 mana. And then finally moving to green, for 2 mana, Poison the Blade will give a creature Death Touch and replace itself. Arcane Archery will give a creature +3/+3 reach, trample, and then you get a boon to buff your next creature that you play. And then Dread Linorm has the Scale Deflection adventure mode, which is to give a creature 2 +1/+1 counters, untap it, and give it hexproof. So it's a little bit more expensive at 4 mana, but since it is a common, it's definitely something that is worth being aware of. Moving on to a final tip for this set: read your cards multiple times. Even if you think you understand it the first time, it is definitely worth checking into it again if it is going to be relevant. They can be very confusing and difficult to understand. It took me quite a while to understand some of the cards, and I definitely don't want you to find yourself in a situation where you lose a game or mess up because you don't know what your cards do, because they are more complicated than normal thanks to these digital-only mechanics and things like that. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy it, remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more content, and comment with your questions or feedback. And if you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave #GoldenGate in the comments section down below, because alchemists wanted to turn lead into gold, and this is Baldur's Gate. So Golden Gate, the perfect combination and the perfect reference for those of you that made it all the way till the end of the video. If you are looking for more content on this set and you'd like to support my videos at the same time, you can access my draft tier list on the NicolaiBolas Patreon at patreon.com/NicolaiBolas. And that's just an extra option for you if you would like to. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.